This is a quick guide to a roughly 6 or 7 month period of the air war over the Western Front during the early part of World War I. Between late summer and early spring of 1915 to 1916, the introduction of the Fokker Eindecker, a fast, maneuverable, single-seater monoplane fighter, granted the German army temporary air superiority. In mid-1916, this period was called the Fokker Scourge for the first time. From late 1914 to the summer of 1915, air combat was a relatively haphazard activity. Aircraft were primarily used in the reconnaissance or light bombing role, and their defensive armament was only slowly being implemented. Early in World War I, it was not at all unusual for enemy aircraft to encounter each other and basically go on their respective ways with little more than a casual wave from one pilot to another. This evolved into the exchange of fire from pistols or rifles with limited success. I've covered early air-to-air combat in a previous video. As this escalated and the requirement to prevent scouting missions became more and more clear, the armament likewise increased with the mounting of light machine guns or even heavy machine guns in flexible mounts. At the same time, experimentation with dedicated fighters was well underway, as exemplified by the Vickers FB-5, the world's first specifically designed fighter, whose development had begun in early 1913. Between 1910 and 1914, 3 patents had been filed that began to address the problem of how to fire a machine gun through the propeller arc. It was becoming clear that this was preferable to a flexible mount. Frenchman Roland Garros experimented with a Morane-Saulnier Type L parasol monoplane and an armoured propeller to deflect rounds being fired through it. 3 air-to-air victories helped to confirm the idea. When a fuel line blockage brought him down behind German lines on April 18, 1915, he and his aircraft were captured. While this didn't inspire the development of the first practical interrupter gear, Anton Fokker's team had been working on this for about 6 months, it certainly seems to have acted as a spur to complete the project, and within a month the Fokker Eindecker E1 was seeing limited service equipped with a single synchronized MG0815 firing through the propeller arc. Quickly followed by the E2 and then the definitive E3, it became clear that this was the way forwards. Development of the Eindecker as an aircraft had been ongoing for some 18 months, and the Germans had been aware of the development of the FB-5 for about the same time, to the extent of actually expressing an interest in acquiring the type in early 1914, before the start of World War I. It truly was a different time. Indeed, German authorities had issued a requirement for a fighter-type aircraft in early 1915 in response to the appearance of the FB-5 and the Morane-Saulnier Type L. A general awareness of the necessity of fighter aircraft had been percolating since the Italian use of aircraft in the Italian-Turkish War of 1911 to 1912. So, rather than a spurt of genius, the Fokker Scourge was really the result of an evolution of aircraft, armament and ideas in an unacknowledged race that was won, however briefly, by the Germans. Additionally, the actual material effect of the Eindecker was really quite limited, especially where compared with later in the war. Only a very limited number of pilots were responsible for the success of the aircraft. It took a skilled pilot to properly handle it, and a skilled pilot of a particular type to use it in combat. Most fighter pilots would be lucky to shoot down 1 or 2 enemy aircraft, and a rarefied few make ace, that is, 5 confirmed air-to-air kills. Even fewer achieve the type of recognition that is associated with consistent success. Thus the Fokker Scourge was largely due to the efforts of a few superlative fighter pilots and a relatively limited number of Eindeckers. The first confirmed air victory of the Eindecker was on July 1st by Kurt Vincenz. The mystique of the Fokker built rapidly, such that tactics were changed to accommodate it, and the Royal Flying Corps in particular despaired of the lack of fighting spirit being exhibited by its squadrons in the face of this new threat. Tactics were changed to provide more protection, and if suitable escorts were not available, reconnaissance missions would be cancelled. The result was significantly reduced effectiveness. While the Eindecker was faster and more manoeuvrable than Allied aircraft, the fight was not one-sided. With two-seaters increasingly equipped with defensive firepower, they were in a position to give themselves at least a fighting chance. Eindecker tactics reflect this, with the preferred attack being a diving assault out of the sun, a burst of fire, and then continuing the dive to avoid return fire. These became a staple of fighter tactics and are notable for their use against the Japanese Zeros 30 years later, when dogfighting them proved less than effective. Despite its notoriety, the Eindecker's effectiveness was limited by the numbers available, and the fact that for most pilots flying the fighter was a secondary role after reconnaissance. Tactics were, however, improving. It is important to realize that the Allied aircraft which would bring German air superiority to an end were already in development at the beginning of the Fokker Scourge. The first of these was the Nieuport 11, a French biplane single-seater fighter which first saw service with the Royal Naval Air Service in November of 1915. It was faster, more manoeuvrable, and less exhausting to fly than the Eindecker, and though not equipped with interrupter gear, nonetheless had its armament, a single Lewis light machine gun, fixed to fire forwards clear of the propeller arc. Its development had begun early in 1915, and first saw flight in May of that year. Rather than release it into the field in dribs and drabs, as had happened with the Fokker, the French stockpiled the Nieuport 11 until it could be fielded in significant numbers. This occurred during the early stages of the Battle of Verdun, which commenced on February 21, 1916. While the Eindeckers had effectively blinded the Allies to the German build-up for this action, there were only 21 available for the battle itself, and they were comprehensively outnumbered by the 90 Nieuports that suddenly appeared. German commentary of the time reflects this. Production and development occurred rapidly, with the Nieuport 11 receiving a more powerful engine to become the Nieuport 16, which was then itself modified to properly accommodate the new power plant and became the definitive Nieuport 17, which joined the air war from May of 1916, though by that point the Fokker Scourge was over. Additionally, new tactics being simultaneously developed on both sides, essentially the formation of hunter-killer groups, served to concentrate offensive capability. However, for the Germans, it was too little, too late, to make a difference. While the blunting of German air superiority can be laid primarily at the feet of the French, the British were not far behind. The Airco DH-2, a biplane single-seater which had first seen flight in June of 1915, began service in January and February of 1916 in limited numbers. 4, to be precise. Reflecting the changes in tactical thinking, 3 squadrons of the new fighter saw frontline service from March, April and May respectively, by which time the Fokkers were outclassed both by numbers and quality of the new Allied aircraft. The DH-2 was not as good as the Nieuports, but it was just fast enough and certainly manoeuvrable enough to outclass the Eindeckers. Like the Nieuports, it too was armed with a single Lewis light machine gun firing forwards, though being a pusher design it didn't have to worry about shooting through its propeller. In June of 1916, the Allies captured a Fokker Eindecker in suitable condition for repair and flight evaluation. This finally put the nail in the coffin of the myth of the Eindecker when its deficiencies were brought to light. Needless to say, new German aircraft were in development. Acknowledging the superiority of the Nieuports, a few captured aircraft were equipped with interrupter gear and better armament and then flown by German pilots. Even at the peak of the Fokker Scourge, the Germans were not resting on their laurels. In addition to the development of improved tactics and organization, new aircraft were in development and entering service. Fokker produced the Eindecker E4, which was faster and more heavily armed, though less maneuverable, but nonetheless saw limited service from December 1915. The Halberstadt D2, a little better than the Eindecker, began entering service as early as February 1916. However, its story, and those of its contemporaries and successors, will be covered in other videos. The back-and-forth nature of aircraft development and temporary air superiority was to continue unabated until the end of the First World War. If you have questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I shall answer them in a dedicated video. In the meantime, please like and subscribe.